I've been working for most of my career directly with communities of various sorts, typically with low-income communities in housing and urban design, community design. And there's been an effort in Montana since I've moved back there 3 years ago. There's been, not because of me, but it just started to be developed there, of really developing concern about sprawl. And it kind of seems a little bit strange because we only have 800,000 people in the entire state, and it's a massive state. So for somebody from the outside, you look around and you say, well, what's the problem? It's a beautiful place. But the reality is that the kind of sprawl that we have is very different from what you have in outlying suburban regions. It's a form of rural sprawl that is quite, it's very, very low density. In fact, the most common suburban subdivision now in outlying regions of Bozeman, Montana, for example, are 20-acre ranchettes, we call them. And these are 20-acre home sites. And they'll take an old farm and very randomly chop it up into 20-acre little sites and sell each of those homes. And what's interesting is that kind of sprawl, even though you really may only add a few dozen units in a section of land, the cumulative impact is much higher. Part of the reason it's higher is because every one of those units has to have a road leading to it. Every one of those units has to have its own septic. And another big part of it is that we don't live in a landscape that is like the East Coast, where I spent quite a bit of time in Boston and New England, where you see a lot of the density can be hidden because of the beautiful rolling hills and forested land. So you'll be driving along and get the sense that really it's quite a pristine area, when in fact, if you were up in an airplane, you'd realize that it's quite heavily occupied. In Montana, we have these very wide open spaces. So if you have a house out there, it's very visible from the roadway, from the public. The other thing, though, is that, as Joe was mentioning, this is a truly pristine environment. Not pristine, but the area specifically we're looking at is the area around Yellowstone Park, which is a protected wildlife and natural wonder of the world that is recognized by the world. But the borderlands around it are becoming incredibly developed. And so there's a lot of concern. Now, what is that going to do to wildlife corridors? Joe mentioned buffalo. Well, we actually do have buffalo coming into Paradise Valley, but they're hazed back in to the park in a very brutal manner, which is also a big controversy in our state, because of concern that buffalo will spread brucellosis amongst cattle, which is a myth because it's never been documented to ever happen. But consequently, it's those kinds of things that in this very remote area that these things start to impact the environment in ways that we don't think about. Also, you've probably been hearing about the forest fires that we've been having in Montana and regions like that. A big cause of those forest fires is, in fact, the desire for so many of these new home sites to be built along the national forest boundary edges. So you get a lot of activity on these edges, and that is starting to lead to accidents and things occurring that lead to fires, and it's becoming a major issue. The other one is the issue of wildlife corridors themselves. We're talking about migratory herds of elk, deer, buffalo, that move across these landscapes that don't obviously recognize the border of Yellowstone Park as any particular meaningful thing. And so we're really talking about protecting a precious landscape. I was approached at a conference that I went to called Big Sky or Big Sprawl. And I was approached by an organization called the Park County Environmental Council. And this was in 1999. And they asked me to come up with some thoughts about how we might be able to encourage planning in the county of Park County, which is called Park because it's adjacent to the park. There's two park counties. There's one in Montana and there's one in Wyoming on either side of the park. And we brainstormed. We thought, now what can we do to address this issue and get the public mobilized to start to plan? Because the big issue is that there is no planning whatsoever in these regions that you, in any way that you could actually call planning. There are master plans, for example, but they really have no legal structure to enact any of the goals of those master plans. So what they were trying to do is encourage citizen-initiated zoning and other tools and mechanisms that currently do not exist there or are ebbing very slowly. And that the idea about citizen-initiating zoning is that it can go above the heads, in a way, of the landowners or out to the people in general, because the landowners in Montana are traditionally, in many parts of Montana, are traditionally very conservative, very suspicious of government, very suspicious of planning of any sort. And I am very familiar with that because I myself am a fifth-generation Montanan on the white side of my family, and my family is a family of ranchers and farmers who married Crow Indians on the Crow side of my family. So as I tried to express in an article I wrote about this, I've been involved in this, my family has been involved in this struggle over land issues in Paradise Valley since the Blackfeet were trying to take it from my tribe, the Crows, 200, 300, 400 years ago. And in fact, the Crows were in an incursion into that area as they moved out from the Great Lakes region 400 years ago and came into this precious valley. And the Crow Reservation extended into Paradise Valley, and almost the whole quarter of the southeast quarter of Montana originally was the Crow Reservation. So it's something very close to me. We decided we would try to do something about this, as using our skills as architects and planners to think, well, what could we do? We talked about doing a charrette. I've developed a lot of charrettes, done a lot of community-based charrettes. Was involved in the coordinating the University of Washington's urban design charrette for several years under Doug Kelbaugh out there when he was head. And I knew the power of visual imagery. We were involved, for example, in the Seattle Commons charrette that was a major impact on the development of the idea of a park in that community. And so I'm an inherent believer in the power of the pencil to impact communities, to get people to think about these things. But we were concerned that if it was just a charrette, a bunch of architects coming in and talking about this, that we wouldn't convince a pretty skeptical public. So we thought about this quite a bit, and we decided to do what is called a build-out analysis. Now, are most people here familiar with what a build-out analysis is? A build-out analysis is something that's been done really primarily in suburban areas, outside of, in the outlying areas of cities. And what it is you basically say, here's the zoning. What would it look like, for example, if you took the area between Muncie and Indianapolis, it's all zoned presumably, what would happen if you just drew what the zoning says is allowable all the way from Muncie to Indianapolis? What would it look like? And so if it's R3 zoning, you put in that number of residential units. If it's commercial, you put malls in, and you draw all this stuff up. And the intention is to say, well, here's what the legal structure allows. This is what you say, the eventuality is that if nothing else changes, eventually this is what this place will look like. The problem that we faced in Paradise Valley, and let me try to bring up some of this stuff here so we have some images to go with this. This is going to be a little tricky because I want to show you some of the views here in just a second. Well, this isn't a particularly spectacular view, but Paradise Valley is a pretty spectacular place, and it's not named Paradise by accident. It truly is a beautiful region of the United States. And the issue, though, for us as planners is that just one second, sorry. Here, let me show you some of these images here. If you see the beauty of this place, Paradise Valley is, I don't know if that's coming through too well, but it's a river corridor that runs between the town of Livingston, Montana, and Yellowstone Park. And this is the Yellowstone River. The Yellowstone Lake is the birthplace of the Yellowstone River in Yellowstone Park, and it flows out of the park through this valley and eventually links up with the Missouri River. And we began our analysis by doing a flyover of the valley, getting up in a very small airplane and flying around and really trying to get a feeling of the whole valley, photographing it. And as you can see from the air and from the ground, it appears relatively pristine. There's actually pretty minimal development of this. The development that you do see is in small clusters of subdivisions and in some scattered site housing along the river. You can kind of see a bit of it here in terms of the sorts of development that I'm talking about. So we pursued this build-out analysis. Here's Park County. You can see it here. Do I have a laser pointer here? Or maybe, oh, you can just see it with the clicker here. That's all right. Okay, thank you. But this is the park itself. The surrounding counties have varying growth rates. These are average growth rates over a 10-year, or a total cumulative growth rate over a 10-year period. So like Gallatin Valley is at 26.5%, and that's where Bozeman is. Park County is really at 10% and relatively low growth rate period. Now, you get down into Teton County, which is down near Jackson, Wyoming, Jackson Hole, and you're at 66% growth rate. A tremendously rapid development there, and Teton at 30%. What's happening is that Gallatin Valley, I was telling Olin today that my house that I bought 3 years ago, we sold this summer for twice what we paid for it. And it's aspenizing. The area is aspenizing. And once it starts to happen, it's a snowball effect. And people don't really realize, I don't think, what is happening there. And so the point of, a big part of our mission as we saw it was to really develop a study that would create a visualization of the future before it happens. Because the big problem with sprawl is that it, especially rural sprawl, is it happens so slowly that you really don't even realize it. Like for myself, returning after 15 years of being away from Bozeman, Montana, it was shocking to see this valley built out. But if you're living there, it's a slow event. And so it's hard to really get a handle on. So we started to look at the valley, and one of the things we looked at to get a sense of growth was septic tanks. And we requested from the county their data on septics. The reason we use septics is that every house outside of Livingston or Gardner, which are the two towns on either end of the valley, are on septic tanks. So we requested this information directly from the county. They gave us a spreadsheet. We counted. We had a graduate student who did a count, and it gave us a sense of the rate of growth. And what we called this was an indicator of growth. And as you can see here, that based on this analysis, the growth rate is approximately doubling every 10 years, which is pretty substantial, even though their numbers are quite small. It is effectively a exponential growth, and given that, what will happen is pretty clear as you start to expand upward. Now, obviously, this growth isn't necessarily going to continue at this rate. It's going to even off. It's going to change. But this is one indicator of what the potential growth might be. Now, the other thing that we looked at is the subdivisions. The thing about Paradise Valley is that as I said before, it's not zoned. So how do you do a build-out analysis of something that has no zoning? It was a difficult challenge. We had no mathematical tool to simply do the build-out. The reality is that there is zoning, a sort of default zoning in the county of the state of Montana, and it's based on the Department of Environmental Quality standard that says that you cannot have more than one house, one septic tank per acre. Now, so consequently, it sort of becomes a default zoning of 1 acre zoning. And there are areas like outside of Billings, the major city of Montana, where you're actually seeing that. You're getting 1 acre houses crowded in an area. It doesn't sound like that would be crowded, but when it's on septic, and you have a high water table, you can poison the water table very quickly with 1 acre zoning in septics. So if we were to follow that logic of the traditional build-out analysis in Paradise Valley, what we would have done is we would have identified all the buildable land in the valley, and then we would have drawn little dots every acre, on every acre of land. And we thought, well, I don't know if that's going to be very something that people are going to buy into, that they wouldn't believe it. They'd say, well, that's never going to happen, and it probably won't happen. So we wanted to look at other ways of examining what might happen. So one of the things we did, besides looking at the septic tanks, is we looked at the subdivisions. And what's happening is that it's quite a pretty simple process to get a subdivision there in town, in the valley, in the county. And one of the meetings we had with the county brought up the issue of the fact that the county's website, the Park County Planning Office's website, if you call it up, only has one thing on it, and that is a subdivision application. And that's pretty much what they do. They permit out subdivisions. Somebody says, oh, I want to divide my piece of land, and they go through a process. Now, up until about 1991, 92, there was almost no rules at all. And then they established a rule that you had to get a review process if you were subdividing anything less than 20 acres. So they started to develop a increase in the number of reviews. What that actually led to was a explosion in subdivisions prior to that ruling went into effect. So people ran to the office and filed all kinds of subdivisions very quickly. And so we decided to see, well, what do these subdivisions look like? Now, if you've ever been into a county planning office or any sort of city office and looked up plat books in a city, plat books are big books that show sections of land, and you page through them and you see these sections. But you only see things one at a time. So what we did is we were fortunate enough, they had put into digitized all of their septics up to the year 1993, or all their subdivisions. So all we did was we linked those subdivisions all the way from Livingston to Gardner in the computer, and then we overlaid that onto an aerial photograph. This isn't the whole length of it, this is a part of it. But this is just existing subdivisions. And what we found was that nearly the entire river corridor is already subdivided, down to 40-acre subdivisions or smaller. And that alone we thought was shocking enough information to sort of put out to the public. I mean, that was a pretty big revelation for most of us. Now, as you can see, though, that a lot of these subdivisions don't, we outlined all the roads in yellow here in our map and all the houses in black, and you can see a lot of these subdivisions have no houses on them. So what we did was we decided we're going to do this build-out, and we did it in 3 stages. We called it Build-Out 1, initially Build-Out 2, and Build-Out 3. And it was pretty simple. All we did was we took the dots that we see there, and we doubled the number. And then we doubled it again, and we doubled it again. And the first doubling just filled in all the existing subdivisions. The second doubling added a whole another layer of subdivisions and houses. Now the way we did these patterns was we basically followed as carefully as we could the existing patterns that were there from the existing subdivisions and simply expanded those. It was a relatively random process based on the reality that subdivision is a random process. It's dependent on the landowners and what they're going to do. And we were doing a very small study. This was a $12,000 study. And so, as I said, this in 1999 when I agreed to do this study, I sat down in my office, I said, okay, 150 hours, a couple of assistants, 12,000 bucks, I'll be done with this in 3 months. It's 3 years later, 1,500 hours, and it's still going. It doesn't stop. But anyway, so this isn't a business for making money. But so we laid this out and did our build out. And you can see here, this is a build out, the build out 2 showing the addition of these subdivisions. And then we did the third build out and layered these onto the map. Now, when we did this initially, we didn't actually have years attached to these at all, because a build-out analysis has no predictive year typically. It just says, hey, this is what it's going to be like eventually if you don't do something about it. But we thought that, well, you know, our goal here is to get people to think about this in a proactive way. And so we didn't want to just draw something that says, okay, well, this isn't going to happen in 100 years, so who cares? I won't even be around. So we want to say, well, when is this going to happen? So we started to looked at the septic analysis, and we said, well, that's showing us something. It says it's doubling about every 10 years. But we weren't convinced that that would be enough to convince what we knew was a very skeptical audience. So we decided, since we're architects, we're not scientists, we're going to hire a scientist. And we hired a guy named Bruce Maxwell, who is a soils scientist at Montana State, who a few years ago had gotten a $250,000 grant from NASA to develop a land use prediction system to try to predict what would happen to land over time. And so we decided, well, let's really do due diligence on this and utilize this system. And for a couple $1,000, since it was already developed, he agreed to develop this. And what this is a computer program in which you take the it's quite, let's see, this opens up. I don't know if you can see it, it's not blowing up on this map, but basically what you do is you take aerial photographs from different years and you overlay a grid, in this case a 10-acre grid, onto the onto an aerial photograph, and then you have a whole ranking of classifications for each potential cell, like whether it's grassland or housing or farmland or whatever it might be. And then you establish each one of those cells and you input that into a computer. And then you take 1 year, in this case we took 1979 and 1991, and you say, well, what happened in that interim? And you say, okay, in 1979 there was bottomland pasture, 1991 it was still bottomland pasture, but based on all of the other changes that took place between 79 and 91, you get a probability factor that will say that its potential to become residential for that particular site. And these probability factors are based on what actually occurred between 1979 and 1991. Now, if this was a more extensive study and we had more money, we would have done 3 decades as opposed to 2. But we were limited in our funding, so we did just 2 decades. And they've done this for several different areas, and the way you test it is you look at what actually occurred, and they find that they have about a pretty high rate, about 70% success rate in prediction in terms of what actually occurs by working backwards. So this was our big scientific tool that we were going to convince the public that, hey, this isn't smoke and mirrors. This is really, going to happen. And so we tried to really create something here that people would be able to say, oh, I get it. Yeah, I see. You better plan this valley. So that growth model then, with that, you create this prediction. So you see 1979, now it's pretty hard to see at this scale, But 1979 actual, almost no red. Red is residential. And you see 91, you start to see these pockets of red. 2003, which was a prediction, even though it's only next year because of our jump from 91 to 2003. And this is where we would test it next year. And then the 2015 projection, 2027 projection, 2039 projection. And as you can see in the 2039 scenario, that pretty much the valley is rampant with subdivisions throughout the valley. Let's see now. So here you see the comparison between was actually there in 1991, what the prediction is for 2039. Now, this sort of analysis has not just been done at our university. There are several universities that have developed similar models for land use prediction. And there was one done in Gallatin Valley in our county, and it was presented at a big public event. And they showed this same sort of stuff with all these dots. And the thing that really struck me was that the people still really didn't get it. You know, you see a little bit of red here, a lot of red there, and they're like, yeah, okay, well, what does that mean? You know, it's really not very accessible to the average person. The impact of it is not clear. It's like, okay, there's more red dots. So what we decided is that we need to do things that are much more clear to the average person. That's why we wanted to do things like overlaying aerial photographs. But our final step that was most important to us in this effort was to do actual visualization, more in the charrette mode of things, to present to the public what this would feel like. Because in the end, this is an architectural exercise, in my view. And as architects, our goal is not, we're not scientists per se, we're not environmental scientists. We are attempting to visualize for people the future, whether it's a design project or in this case, a analysis of potential future events. So we took a particularly beautiful view of the valley that was very familiar to people. This is called Mill Creek, and Mill Creek comes in here into the Yellowstone River. And we did a sketch overlay of that. And the intent here was to say, okay, here's what we have today. And we listed the attributes of the valley today. Abundant open space, working farms and ranches, valley population principally clustered in and near small towns, a variety of income levels residing in the valley, minimal river corridor development, high quality of rural life, healthy fish and wildlife habitat, commercial activity largely limited to town centers, tax revenue already insufficient for services and infrastructure required. That's the sort of existing condition. Then we say, okay, now, what is Paradise Valley tomorrow? Conventional growth. And this is what we drew. And this was based on all of this analysis that we did, but it was also based on common sense. The reality is I could have drawn this drawing before I did any of the other study, frankly, because it's not rocket science. It's happening just in the valley adjacent. This is what we're seeing. And we drew in the aerial view, all these very low density subdivisions sprawling in. This is the highway that connects Yellowstone Park to Livingston, and the presumption is that over time that's going to start to become like a 99 sort of corridor with commercial activity. And this is in fact occurring in another area that we looked at in the study, which is Gallatin Gateway, which is another entry into the park. So we drew it up. And we did not put a year on this. We just said, this is Paradise Valley tomorrow, given current trends and conventional growth. Open space is limited to large lot yards and public lands. Farms and ranches have been replaced by subdivisions. Population is spread across the valley in a low-density sprawl. The river corridor is highly developed. Suburban character has replaced rural character. Low and middle income families no longer are available in the valley. Fish and wildlife habitats greatly reduced. Highway 89 is a continuous commercial strip. Water quality is threatened by density of septics. Tax revenue is inadequate for services and infrastructure required. Then we said, okay, well, that's the worst case scenario. What if some planning took place? We decided we would draw Paradise Valley tomorrow an alternative to sprawl. What would that look like? And when we drew this, we talked a lot about what would be our alternative. And for those of you who are familiar with the methodology of clustered subdivisions and that sort of approach, one way is to simply take the exact same number of units and redistribute them in a more clustered fashion. But we decided that, well, you know, that really is not enough. What really has to happen is that growth boundaries have to be developed around Livingston and Gardner and Bozeman, and that densities have to be increased there to take the total density, and that an overall number of units might even be reduced in the valley itself, but those that do get built would be built in cluster subdivisions, or as is more popular in Montana, a single large landowner might own all of this land and sell off some pristine lots in a corner of it. Or the other potential in a cluster subdivision is that you have lots in which each of these folks actually own all of this land, but instead of just scattering out every 20 acres, they hold in common and lease out to a farmer the rest of the land so that they can keep the beauty of the place and limit the infrastructure. So housing in this view is clustered to protect open space, view sheds, wildlife corridors, and agriculture. Commercial activities clustered at major intersections and near population centers. Open space is abundant. Farms and ranches remain viable. Mixed income housing is maintained. Now that's a pipe dream in a sense. It's something that I would want to see maintained. The reality is that where this has been done, these homes that I've drawn are way more valuable than they're actually in the last scenario that I showed. So in fact, that's something that is a big problem. How do you maintain affordable housing in these pristine resort areas? And that's what we're seeing happening in Teton County near Jackson, and in Bozeman, where my house just doubled in value. Rural characters maintain. Fish and wildlife habitat is protected. Water quality remains high. Now, it's important to point out that these lists that I'm showing here, like rural characters maintained, that is listed in the Park County, all of these things, river corridor being protected, fish and wildlife, all these things are listed in the current Park County master plan as priorities for the people that live there. But there's nothing enacted to make it happen. So even though they're saying they want this thing, they're doing this other thing. So what we wanted to demonstrate is, well, you're going to have to do something to get to what you say you want, and it requires planning. So let's see. Then the final thing that we did was what we called a toolkit. And we thought, well, you know, you've got this beautiful place. We're saying that you need to do these things. But how do you do those things? We didn't want to just leave it open-ended. So we did a pretty simple, we didn't do an exhaustive study, but we listed out using the American Farmland Trust's kind of compendium of tools that are used around the country to protect agricultural and wildlife zones, things like agricultural conservation easements, cost of community services studies, which, by the way, on this tax issue, it's been proven repeatedly that farmland is actually a net gain for counties in terms of tax revenue, whereas subdivisions are net losses. Because what happens is as you subdivide and put in all the schools and the roads and the services, but you still maintain a low tax base because it's a very low density, you end up with a loss. Tax relief, market approaches, purchase of conservation easements, transfer or purchase of development rights, farm and transfer estate planning, right to farm laws, real estate transfers, agricultural protection zoning, zoning itself, and growth management laws. So our idea was that we're not going to say, here's the solution. We're just going to say to the community, here's some options for you to look at. Now, as Joe knows, this, at the first public presentation of this thing, was the most controversial part of the study, believe it or not. We thought it was the most, when we did it, the most sort of democratic way you could do it. We just listed, well, here's what you could do. So that really is the study, and I'd like to pause here for a moment before I then go into discussing the controversy over the study. Any questions or comments on what we've done? We got one in Bozeman, but it's not drawn on here. But in fact, it's a good point. You know, what happens is you have a rancher right outside of Bozeman, Montana, and he hates planners, hates planning, anything about planning. He's probably my uncle, and except that'd be outside of Billings instead of outside of Bozeman. And then what happens is the farmer next to him sells his farm, and they build a Walmart there. And then he's the first guy to show up and say, what the hell's going on here? Why is there a Walmart there? Like, well, you said you didn't want planning. What are you talking about? It's his private property rights. He can build a Walmart there. He could build a 60-story office tower if he wanted. It's his right. And you gave it to him. And you protected it. And it's an interesting kind of conundrum. And the thing that is very difficult for me to understand is that people like my uncle, who's a big rancher in Montana, love Montana. And they love the land. And they themselves, in many respects, are true stewards of the land that they own. When you own 20,000 acres, you know, and you keep it as a ranch, even though it's ridiculous economically speaking, you're doing it for more than money, believe me. These people are land rich. My uncle has lived in a trailer house on 10,000 acres for his entire life. And people but what they don't recognize is that this is changing and that their kids are selling out, or their grandkids are selling out, or, you know, next door to them is some guy who doesn't share their values, doesn't share their concerns, and they are unprotected. But they believe in this kind of old school idea that, hey, you know, I wouldn't do that to my land. And they're surprised if someone else does it. Other comments on the study? Thoughts?
Did you look at what might be driving the growth, the job creation? Why would it be doubling? What's causing folks to come there other than it's a scenic place?
Well, yeah, we didn't go into, it wasn't an economic study, although it's something we would like to do. But one of the things that people look at this and they say, well, how could that be? You're showing, you know, this tremendous growth in this little area, whereas it's growing at 10% county-wide over 10 years. How could that be true? Well, the 10% thing is, first of all, census information. And the census information is based on people who live permanently in those areas. but in fact the primary growth is second home buyers in these regions. And they're there because of for one reason, and that is the beauty of the place. In fact, one of the interesting things about it, though, is that the real estate industry loves it, because what happens is that people go and watch a river runs through it, and they see an ad on a website or something for a farm in Montana, 20 acres, and they buy it up and they race out there, and they're in their dream house, and they realize after one winter that nobody's plowing the 3-mile drive up to their door, nobody's there to collect the trash, there's no schools that they can send their kids to that they don't have to get in a Jeep and drive them out, in the middle of winter to. There's no stores anywhere. It isn't paradise, to be frank. Plus, when you build that way, scattered site subdivisions like this on huge 20-acre ranchette sprawls, it's building almost the opposite way from the way the original homesteads and farmers would build. They would build clusters of structures, and they would build tree windbreaks, because the wind is tremendous in these areas. And where I live in Bozeman, we're in a traditional neighborhood, and it's a microclimate. But you get outside where these new subdivisions are going in, and it's very inhospitable environment. But, people, they don't hang outside very much. They're in their sealed-off houses, and, they get in their RV and they drive to the ski resort, and they're only there 3 weeks out of the year anyway, so but the actual, the reality of Montana is that we're losing population in large areas, in the northeastern areas particularly, and then we're gaining population in these kind of resort areas where you're near a national park, where you're near ski areas, and people, Ted Turner has a ranch, 150,000 acre ranch just outside of Bozeman, Montana, in Ennis. People who can own anything in the world, want to own a piece of this, because it's so spectacular.
How would you compare this? I know you travel throughout the West, and I don't spend any time in Arizona, where the growth is just phenomenal, and that's the principal reason for the natural beauty. Is this a future Arizona in that sense, or like a Prescott, Arizona, or Jerome, or Sedona?
I think absolutely it is. Bozeman already, we say that it's aspenizing, and it is. I mean, when the house doubles value in 3 years, you're seeing that people are recognizing these places, and they're coming to them. And we were at a community meeting as part of the controversy, which I'll go into in a minute here, and one of this woman stood up. She was like 60 years old, and she said, I'm one of those people from California, and I've lived in a lot of places that used to look like this and don't anymore. And she's like, are you people nuts? Do you think that this isn't going to happen? Do you think you're somehow immune to this? Because there was all these people that were saying this ain't going to happen. So I guess I may as well go into the controversy at this point. So I guess the question I really wanted to ask before I went into that was to the people, the planners here, and maybe you can explain it, talk about it after. We felt that we were pretty diligent in our effort to try to go through several different ways of really looking at the same thing. And we did it very consciously with the expectation that this would be controversial. But we really thought that we had no idea, really, frankly, what we were in for. We presented this very boldly. We decided that we weren't going to just, put out a little report and present it at a conference somewhere. That wasn't our intent. What we did was we put this thing into a newspaper insert and put it out to 30,000 people all throughout Bozeman and Livingston, the whole region. And in it, we laid out all the key aspects of this analysis. And that was very intentional, because this is, this was an academic study, but the client, the Park County Environmental Council, is a political organization. They paid for the study. They wanted to get this out and to the general public. And that, they're not a minority at all. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of support for this kind of effort. In fact, that was why we put this out in the newspaper. We weren't reaching out to the landowners. We decided that the landowners, and maybe we were wrong, in our approach, but our basic idea was that the landowners are not going to change. They have a very clear idea of what the world is. They're 75 years old, many of them, and they're not going to allow planning no matter what. They see it as a taking of their value. So we decided to sort of go around them to the general public and say, if you really love this place, you might want to do something about it, because this is what it looks like is going to occur. And that generally, I think, is a view shared by the views that the Park County Environmental Council is shared by many of the people, because that's why they've moved there. The irony is that in a place like Montana, that the people who grew up there and lived there, like myself, are often less willing to take the sort of actions to protect the place. That they've grown up in an economy based on resource extraction, ranching, farming, and they have grown up really with the notion that land is a commodity that you utilize for your livelihood, whether it's forest products or deer you go and shoot for dinner. So really, it's a changing population. And I think it's, in many respects, after returning, being gone for 15 years away from Bozeman, Bozeman has become much more kind of worldly and much more protective, I would say, of the natural landscape in a very different way. And, in a blunt sort of way, it's become less redneck, is what, it appears. Anyway, so we came to, we made the decision that we were going to present this study at a academic conference. And it really wasn't, let's see, what should I show you here? It really was not the intent to do it that way. It just sort of was a timing thing. We decided, well, okay, we're going to present it at this conference, and we were hosting the ACSA regional conference, and the conference, based on its location, which was in Paradise Valley, we decided to locate the conference in Paradise Valley at this beautiful place called Chico Hot Springs, which is a wonderful little resort there. And we titled the conference Borderlands Contested Terrain. And then we invited people to talk about that. And I wrote a column about this. I write a monthly column in the Bozeman Chronicles magazine that they put out about architecture. And in that, after this controversy, I wrote about this. And one of the things I said was that, here we were for 2 days chatting about contested terrain in a very, I would say, intellectually removed way. And then at the end of it, we had set this thing up where we were presenting this thing for the first time publicly after the newspaper had come out to all these ranchers, we put it out publicly. We invited the public, and then we had the academics there from all over the country, and we had the community invited. And as Joe can tell you, it was a pretty eventful event, and literally it was one in which the issue of small arms was raised. You know, that these are folks who are all members of the NRA for one thing, and all are. And I remember going into one meeting after this, and I overheard one of the ranchers, and he said, "So, Pete Story, who's one of the biggest ranchers in the valley, Pete, were we supposed to bring our sidearms?" And Pete said, "Well, I knew you would anyway." You know, didn't have to tell you. Just like, ha, ha, ha. You know. But it's truly, it had that feeling of kind of the Old West, these guys standing in the back of the room. And they were quite perturbed, I'll say, when we presented this, and they'd already seen it in the paper. And the interesting thing was that what they were perturbed about really had more to do with, in that instance, the initial thing they were perturbed about was the toolkit and what they called our plan. It was interesting. They seemed to misconstrue what we were doing here, and they kept talking about our plan. We're like, well, we didn't do a plan. You know, we haven't done a plan. This is simply a study. We're hoping that you'll do a plan. But we just wanted to point out, you know, some key issues here. But they kept talking about, well, we're talking about zoning and conservation easements and this and that, and well, you know, that's just not what we want here. And we said, well, that's why we called it a toolkit. You know, this is just, we didn't say you have to do any of these things, but these are things you could enact if you want to protect this valley. But it was interesting in terms of what issues were raised at that. And it was very emotional. I mean, people would stand up, and this one guy I was talking about back when, 30 years ago, he talked about when the grass was coming up to the belly of his horse, you know, and how he could get up in the morning and see the deer getting up in the morning, and now he's waking up and seeing his neighbors, you know, starting their RVs or whatever. And, it's a different world, you know, for him. And he was saying it from the other perspective of wanting to protect that. And there was voices like that in that community, in that crowd. But the most loud voices and the most emotionally charged typically were the folks who saw us as these academics who were going to come in and tell them what to do, I think, you know, is basically the way they perceived it. And one guy, it was interesting, he admitted, he said, yeah, I've got a 20 acres, or no, he didn't even have 20 acres, I think he had about 5 or something. I'm not a big owner like Pete Story, but let me tell you, I have more faith in what Pete Story is going to do with his land than I do in you, or your people, you know. And it was funny because after the meeting, I went up to Pete Story, and he is about a 75-year-old rancher, and I told him, I said, hey, Pete, I bet you know my uncle. And he said, what? And I said, yeah, Jay Stovall. And he's like, Jay Stovall, he's your uncle? He couldn't believe it, because my uncle was a state legislator, one of the most conservative in the state, and Pete Story was also a state legislator. And they're both big ranchers, and they, you know, are devout believers in the God-given right of property ownership, and that somehow any notion about planning is seen as an attack on that presumably God-given right. So anyway, he said, well, you sure don't talk like him. You know. And it's true, I don't talk like him, and but the funny thing is I've spent my childhood arguing over the dinner table with my dad and my uncle about these very issues. And it's within families. So anyway, we presented the thing publicly at that meeting. We got the primary concerns there were issues about the stuff we're showing. But then there was another meeting about a week later in Livingston. And at that meeting, we presented in Livingston to the larger public only. And right before the meeting, there was a letter sent to all the newspapers and to the president of the university and to the chair of my department and to all saying that this study is just unbelievably untrue and outrageous exaggeration, and that it's filled with factual error, and that this isn't worthy of the university, and all this kind of stuff. Really, and it was signed by all the Park County commissioners and all these people. And, you know, when you're a tenure track professor, it's a little bit disturbing when the letters go to your bosses, basically. I don't mind the newspaper, but, you know. And so they literally, I mean, in my perception, were sort of going after me and my job and what I'm doing, and, you know, state legislators calling up the president of the university and hassling them about this thing. And so it started this kind of newspaper war that's been going on for about 3 months now. Letters back and forth, the editor, and saying that this is wrong and that's right. And the interesting thing is that the letters to the editor have been running about 10 to 1, I'd say, in our favor. The people are like, what are you guys, nuts? You know, like the woman from California. I mean, but people are I haven't had to do much defending per se, because, you know, there's plenty of very erudite citizens there who were standing up in defense of the study and saying that, you know, this is a very well done study and it makes a lot of sense. But I want to explain some of the things that they brought up, and there were some issues that they raised about. The big thing was what you would call a data attack. Now that is something that, you know, every time any study is released that has any sort of controversy attached to it, the data is questioned. Now, when my client, the Park County Environmental Council, came to me, I said I wanted to do this as Glenn and Glenn Design Associates. I didn't want to do it through the university just because, you know, I knew of the 12,000, I'd get 1,000. That was part of the reason. But also, I just thought it would be simpler and more straightforward. But they wanted to do it with the university, specifically because they wanted the name of the school behind this thing because they knew it would be attacked, and they wanted the kind of prestige of the university. So we decided to go ahead and do it within the auspices of the university, within our department. And so my perception is, of course, that this is a political attack, and they're searching for things wrong with the study. But in their search, it's been a pretty intensive attack, and so it's been very difficult for me over the last few months, just dealing with this whole thing. But I'll briefly go over some of the issues they've raised. One of them is the issue of the septics. It turns out, and this is where I don't have my other stuff that's in my computer here to show you, but the septic tank analysis was questioned. And it was interesting because they said, well, you know, we didn't make this up. We just asked for this information from the county. And in fact, all the information is from the very same county that was attacking us. So that was very strange. The subdivision information, the septic information, you know, there really is very little data per se in the whole study. And so they were focusing a lot on this particular graph. And it turns out that, in fact, that these numbers are incorrect. to a certain extent, or to a pretty substantial extent. And it's due to the flawed data that we got from the county. They gave us all this information, said these are X number of septics. It turns out that those septics was not clear in any way that these were often repeated, and they would show like a septic that was built 1 year and then refurbished 10 years later, and it would appear as double that. So this fellow who is on the Park County Planning Board he said about 50 hours into an audit of the septic information that they had, and went through, and he admitted himself, of course not publicly, that if you were not aware of these flaws, it would be very difficult to figure that out when you're simply tabulating the data as we did. And he found that, in fact, these numbers are much lower as figures. So like the 740 is closer to 400, and the 1470 is closer to 800, and the 3025 is closer to 1500. But guess what? It doubles every 10 years. And the important thing is that our graphic that we showed was not based on total numbers. What we did, because we did it graphically, is we took the actual number of units that were on the ground in the existing condition. In this case, we simply took those dots that were in our studies area and we doubled them, as I said, and doubled them again. So the actual numbers don't change. The impact of what it would look like, and that was our goal, doesn't change at all. Our argument at this point, anyway, is that, in fact, our intent was we were doing the septic analysis not for total numbers, but for, as we said in the study, an indicator of growth and a trend. That's what we were trying to get at, was a trend, and that's what we used to develop the analysis. So that, in fact, our graphic that we show in the end here in 2039 is based on a relatively, we still believe, accurate prediction of what that might look like. But also, we didn't just use the septic information. That was just one indicator. As I've tried to exhaustively express, we used this whole predictive analysis of the computer program that was specifically designed to analyze this sort of thing, and those correlated. So, but anyway, so now we're in a position where we have to defend this information. Another thing that was raised was the issue, and this is where I wish I had my, I could bring up my imagery here. But one of the things was raised is that they were saying, well, wait a minute, there's lands here that we have subdivided that are public lands, state lands, for example. And what we've done since then is we've begun to analyze all this. But like they're saying, well, there's a fishing access right here, or there are all these other factors that we didn't take into account, or they're saying we didn't take into account. One of them is conservation easements. They said, well, you know, there's a conservation easement right on this site. And we ignored it. And the reality is that we didn't ignore the conservation easements. This is a typical thing that you deal with when you're in any scientific or architectural planning kind of survey, is you have limits of data. And the conservation easements that we had access to when we did this study, you had to go, in 1999 is when we gathered all this information. The only way we could get the conservation easements is you had to go directly to each of the known organizations that was developing easements and request that data from them directly. Many of them didn't have the information in digital form. We had to take what we had, we laid it onto the map, and we showed it where we knew that it was. But It was not exhaustive. We knew that there were probably areas. It does turn out that there is a conservation easement in our study area. I wish I had the thing to show you, but it was kind of interesting because, let's see where it is. It was, in fact, right about, let's see, I think it's right in this area here. But the funny thing was that it's a very small easement, and the reality is that it was already subdivided. And we didn't even add any subdivisions. The only thing that we did was we put houses where there are already subdivisions in this small area where there was a conservation easement. Another thing they said was that there's all this state land, and I was concerned, you know, because we had used certain maps that we had, and we've since gotten other information, and I got called up this information, and we overlaid it on our map, and I was quite concerned because there was these giant blue squares on our map, and I was like, my God, we really did have a flaw here. And I was thinking, because all this blue, this is state land. So then it turns out, what kind of state land is it? Well, it's state trust land. So I called up the state trust land's attorney. I said, now, we got some state trust land here on our site. It didn't actually overlay many of the things we drew, but there was quite a bit in there. We said, well, now what's the situation with this land? Is that subdivisible? He said, well, actually, it is our constitutional obligation to utilize land to its highest and best use. And if that highest and best use happens to be subdivision, we will subdivide it. Because their duty is to get the maximum income off of that property for the state education fund, which is what the state trust land is for. So it, in fact, isn't protected at all. And so we're going to be, in the next few weeks, demonstrating this kind of stuff, showing that. The other issue was floodplain. Floodplain was something they brought up. And there is, in fact, a floodplain, of course, that runs along the whole river length here. Now, this is an existing survey here, or these are all existing subdivisions. As you can see, these run right up along the river here. The floodplain has been subdivided with regularity for the last 50 years or so. And as I said, our predictions were based on past reality, not on, we built our pattern, so if there were houses here or subdivisions here, we would add more here, for example. Now, the other reason that we didn't take into account the floodplain directly was that the floodplain itself is under a complete revision. The last time the floodplain was done, of course, the river had changed substantially, so there is no truly accurate floodplain at this point that we could utilize to say, well, but it turns out that the only rule that exists for the floodplain, and we, of course, were aware of this when we were doing this, but we have to now reiterate this to the folks there. But the only rule that exists in terms of the floodplain, there is no rule that you cannot build in the floodplain. So, for example, there's a lot of houses built, and there was just a study done by another organization that's found that there's been a 73% increase in the last 20 years in this particular valley in new homes in the floodplain, new homes being built. Now, the only rule that they have for subdivision, as I said, there's no rule against building in the floodplain. The only rule is that you have to build 150 feet from the actual riverfront, which at this scale is almost imperceptible. But the subdivision rule is you can subdivide within the floodplain, but you have to have 1 acre outside of the floodplain. Because the rule is presumably that you need to have a place to put your septic that's out of the floodplain. So what we've done is overlaid this with, we were able to attain a digital floodplain line, and we've overlaid this, and we found that there are, in fact, a few of our things that are entirely within the subdivision or within the floodplain. The great majority, well, almost all of them, have at least 1 acre or substantially more. What we're going to be doing in the next, what we've already done, and I can't show you, is we've overlaid this stuff, and what we're doing now is we are altering every question that they have. If they said, okay, it's floodplain, okay, well, we're going to move it. If there's a concern about this thing, we're going to shift that. And then we're going to present this and say, well, you're right, okay, we messed up. We have a house right here, and it's in the floodplain, or, the subdivision's wrong. But the thing we're going to do is we're going to pick that up and move it to here. And we're going to say, well, does that really matter? We didn't take all kinds of things into account. We didn't take land ownership into account here. That alone would be an exhaustive study. These lines don't follow land ownership lines. We didn't, this was not a plan. This was a illustration of a problem. And what they're doing is they're taking our illustration and they're picking it apart dot by dot, line by line, and saying that because it's flawed data, the whole study is wrong, the conclusions are wrong, you guys are a bunch of muckrakers, causing trouble in our county. And so we're in this defensive posture now to deal with it. So what's happened now is that Joe Bolello has been charged with the university of giving the task of reviewing what we've done. And because the university has requested sort of an outside review of the work, because they have decided, they asked me and my department to present this thing to the provost and to the vice provost who's in charge of research to explain to them what this is all about. I gave a similar thing to what I've done here in a much briefer form to them, and they were like, oh, okay, because they told us before the meeting, they said there was 3 choices. They're either going to take their name off the study and say they want anything to do with it, or they're going to back it but say that we're going to put out a major revision, or they're going to say that they back the study and put out just a clarification of data or anything like that. In the end, they've decided that they're just going to do the third thing. They've decided that, that they were not going to, fortunately, step back for any, because they recognize that this is a political controversy, and they have said that they will not back the study because of the political controversy that it has created, fortunately for us. But it's still, unfortunately, Joe will do his thing and we're doing our deal, but right now we're kind of in a tit-for-tat mode, which I don't think is really very productive. I'm hoping to get beyond that. What I'm hoping to do next is once we've reviewed all this stuff as well, we've already done it, but we're going to present it in a visual form, not to the public, as every time they get like a graph, like that graph I told you, it was taken straight to the newspapers with the changed numbers and said, well, see, you guys are wrong, But what we're going to do is say, okay, we're not going to race to the public to say, see, we were right. We're going to meet with the Park County Commissioners, show them what the areas of disagreement were, try to get some resolution to this whole thing.